Hello, it's me again. Still writing my master thesis, still trying to figure out what to do later this year, but here comes my first tip on what each one of us can do and what we can do together to actually have an impact. Enjoy. We probably all grew up eating meat. Now today there's so many trends about going vegan, going vegetarian, or going to a plant-based diet. Foods in stores become more vegan. There are alternatives to meat, to chicken. Then you find vegan burger patties. There's so many options and so many different opinions out there. Why does it all matter? Now, before you stop watching because you think this is just another guy promoting veganism or promoting plant-based, let me go back to the roots of the problem. The problem that all of this is about is climate change. Humans produce greenhouse gases. That includes CO2, methane, nitrous oxide. Well, humans don't directly produce them, but through what we eat, through our agriculture and so on, we produce a lot of greenhouse gases. Now, why is that bad? To start out with, greenhouse gases are actually a good thing. So without CO2, no life on Earth would be possible because the atmosphere wouldn't be warm enough to sustain life here. What humanity has done over the past 100 or more years is that we've put even more of those gases into the atmosphere, trapping heat around the Earth, meaning that we basically heat up the world. Now that has consequences that we can't really begin to imagine. We know that the ice caps are melting and the water level is rising, but because of temperature changes, we know that mosquitoes can migrate to areas where they've never lived before. We know that weather conditions, storms, are becoming more likely. Not just tiny storms, but big hurricanes and tsunamis. And all of that because we're heating up the planet. Now, there's a huge number of greenhouse gases or equivalents that includes methane and nitrous oxide that humanity emits per year. That number is 51 billion tons. Now, in order to stop climate change or stop all the catastrophic events that can happen, we need to not only reduce the number, but have that number go to zero. I recently stumbled upon Bill Gates' new book on how to avoid a climate disaster, where he talks about a lot of new technologies that can capture carbon from the atmosphere and help us get to zero CO2 emissions net. Like, of course, we will still emit CO2 with all of our activities, but our goal is to have technologies to make the outcome go to zero. Now, I want to talk about what each one of us individually can do to help bring those emissions down without using any fancy technology, without changing our everyday life to just live in a hut in the mountain. But we can still use energy, still go about our daily lives, but just be more aware of what we're doing to this planet. So let me come back to the meat question. 4% of global CO2 emissions are caused by cattle. This includes both beef and dairy. Originally, I only wanted to make statements about beef, just to keep it simple, but it's very hard to find trustworthy numbers, so I decided to go the slightly more complicated route and include both dairy and beef in my calculations. For the sake of these calculations, let's assume that you're eating the same amount of beef and dairy every day. So we're talking about average amounts here. Also, for the later practical values that I want to give you guys, I converted milk into cheese, meaning that 10 liters of milk are equivalent to 1 kilogram of cheese, just to get a more hands-on grasp on the numbers that we're going to talk about. Now, bear with me. Let's start simple. If everybody on the globe would choose not to eat their respective average amounts of beef and dairy for 1 day per week, we would be able to bring global CO2 emissions down by 0.5%. Now, what does that mean for you? This is a harder question to answer because this depends on where you're living. In order to illustrate this, let me present 3 different things. So first of all, in the US, the average person consumes 71 grams of beef per day and 78 grams of cheese. If you compare that to the European Union, the average value there is only 30 grams of beef and 62 grams of cheese, even though the US and the European Union have about the same living standard. To point out the global differences, let's have a look at my last example, the Philippines. In the Philippines, the average person only consumes 9 grams of beef per day and 0.3 grams of cheese. Now, what is my point? My point is that globally, if every person would stop eating their average amount of beef and dairy, we would be able to bring down global CO2 emissions by 0.5%. 0.5% might not sound like a lot, but keep in mind that we're only looking at cattle here. We're not looking at the other food sources or transportations or any other form of industry. This is only the first small step, and climate change sounds like a really huge issue for the entire humankind. It's hard to get a grasp on what individual people can do to make a difference, but this is what I want to get at. That if you choose to not eat the average amount of cheese and beef for 1 day, this can make a difference. If we on top of that implement the technologies that Bill Gates is talking about in his book, we're working towards mitigating a climate disaster. I'm challenging you to try this out with me. All the resources are linked in the description below. Thank you for watching. Thank you for helping to make this world a better place, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye!